All right. Hey guys, can you hear me?
Yes.
Cool. So I'll just be tech support. I don't know. Let's like make sure everything is working.
I'll be Jillian. My name's Jillian. I'll be your actual moderator today.
Okay, so I'm just making sure you guys will have the ability to share your screens. Let's see. Who can share all panelists? All panelists.
Hello.
Hi, so I am Jillian, to be your moderator. I am tech support, so I think I'll be turning my video off once you guys get started. I'm just making sure we have everything set up for you guys before you get in there. So you'll have the ability to share your screens. We're going to be doing the like participation through the Q&A function.
Mm-hmm.
So Jillian will manage that.
You see mine? I'm just testing for you.
I can see it. Yeah.
It's just my engaging, it's just my PowerPoint. Thank
Your PowerPoint matches your sweater today, Kylie.
you. Oh, good. Okay, okay, I'll unshare now.
Okay, so trying to think if there's anything else you guys should know before we get started. Do you guys have any questions for us?
I don't think so.
All right, well, I will turn my video off and start and we'll get going.
Sounds good.
All right, so I believe I'm up first.
I think I have to run through a quick little intro first.
Yes. Yes.
All right. Let some participants come on in. Okay, I'll get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Public Interest Environmental Law Conference. Thank you for coming to our panel on American investments in wildlife infrastructure. My name is Jillian Thayer. I'm a 1L PILC representative, and I'll be moderating this panel. I just have a few announcements, and then we'll get started with the panel. Don't worry if you can't see yourself. This is a Zoom webinar, so all the attendees are automatically muted with videos off, so you will only be able to see the panelists. Throughout the panel, if you have a question, please use the Q&A function rather than the chat function. All of our panelists will be giving their presentations, and then there will be a 15-minute Q&A session at the end where the panelists will answer your questions. Please remember to be courteous of all viewpoints throughout the presentation and QA section. Additionally, if there are any legal professionals in the audience wanting to earn CLE credit for this panel, we will be dropping the link in the Q&A. Also, our alumni board, Friends of Land, Air, Water, helps provide stipends for students doing unpaid public interest environmental law internships. If you are interested in making a donation to help provide students with those stipends, information to do so will be on a Google document in the same link provided for CLE credit. Lastly, the University of Oregon is located on Kalapuya Ilihit, the traditional indigenous homeland of the Kalapuya people. Following treaties between 1851 and 1855, Kalapuya people were dispossessed of their indigenous homeland by the United States government and forcibly removed to the Coast Reservation in Western Oregon. Today, descendants are citizens of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde Community of Oregon and the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians of Oregon, and continue to make important contributions in their communities, at UO, and across the land we now refer to as Oregon. PILC would like to acknowledge the traditional homelands of the Kalapuya peoples in the Willamette Valley and express our respect for the tribal nations of Oregon. We will now introduce our panelists. Kylie Paul works at the Center for Large Landscape Conservation as a road ecologist, advancing the development and implementation of wildlife-friendly transportation policies and projects in international, federal, state, tribal, and local contexts. She has an extensive breadth of professional experience in science, policy, and management of projects and programs. For over 20 years, she's worked in many sectors, including nonprofit conservation, wildlife field research, local government, consulting firms, and private business. Throughout her work, she's focused on creative, collaborative approaches to wildlife conservation and road ecology. We also have Erin Ceto. She's the United States Public Policy Associate for Wildlands Network. Her work includes providing legal analysis and campaign strategies to advance connectivity-focused policies at both the state and federal level. Erin is a University of Oregon Law alum. As a student, she interned with the Office of Regional Solicitor in the Pacific Northwest for the Department of the Interior and clerked for the Transmission, Power, and Natural Resources Division of the Bonneville Power Administration's Office of General Counsel. Upon graduation and before joining Wildlands Network, she joined Sanger Law PC, a firm specializing in administrative litigation and renewable energy development and transactions. Lastly, we have Renee Callahan. She has over 30 years of professional and legal experience in federal, state, and administrative law, policy, and research. As Executive Director for ARC Solutions, Renee leads an interdisciplinary not-for-profit partnership of transportation and wildlife agencies, universities, non-governmental and charitable organizations working to ensure wildlife crossing structures are built wherever they are needed. In addition to raising awareness about proven solutions to reduce wildlife, motorist conflict, and reweave natural landscapes, Renee spearheads ARC's work to foster innovation in the placement, construction, and design of the next generation of wildlife infrastructure. I will now hand it off to the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm going to share my screen right now. Let's see. Can everybody see my PowerPoint and my cute dog? All right, excellent. Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you for having us here today. Again, my name is Erin Ceto, Public Policy Associate for Wildlands Network. As was mentioned, I'm a UO Law alumni, so I'm so excited to be here. This is my fifth PILC that I'm participating in and helping organize. And so I'm very excited to be here. Thank you to the students, faculty, and alumni that work so hard year after year to put this conference together and make sure it's the longest running public environmental law conference in the country. So I'd also like to thank my two co-panelists on this American Investments in Wildlife Structure panel. I appreciate the time and expertise that you're bringing here to us today. So today you're going to be hearing a little bit from me about what wildlife corridors are, why they're important, and what tribal nations, states, and other local governing bodies are doing to help study and implement them. Then you're going to hear from Renee about the details of the recently passed bipartisan infrastructure law, which should help fund some of these wildlife corridor projects. Lastly, and importantly, you'll hear from Kylie Paul on the best practices for stakeholders interested in engaging in this work. So let's jump right in. What is a wildlife corridor? In my mind, there's always been, three different categories of wildlife corridors. And the first one you'll see on the right, that's the road crossings. That's the person-made infrastructure. And on the left, I consider that the landscape corridors or riparian corridors is two different categories. And that's really just the natural land spaces that are left aside so wildlife can move from one core habitat to another. So why should we care about wildlife corridors? Well, habitat fragmentation and barriers to wildlife movement are some of the main contributors to biodiversity loss today. Essentially, wildlife just need to move to find food, water, and genetically diverse mates. And linear barriers like roads, housing developments, sometimes energy projects, fencing, railroads, all these things make it difficult for wildlife populations to maintain genetic robustness within their populations, as well as adapt to climate change. So improving landscape permeability and protecting wildlife corridors is really a necessary and proven strategy towards reducing biodiversity loss. And I'm going to use this next slide to really sort of break that down. And I just added this morning because there was an article posted yesterday to the New York Times, and it showed this map that was produced to show in red here the areas of highest risk for biodiversity loss in the country. And on the left, you'll see green spaces are the protected areas that we have now. So the purpose of this map and this article was really to show just how many more protected spaces we need in this country to be able to reduce biodiversity loss. But I need to add that protected areas are important, but they do become less valuable when they're isolated from other protected areas. And a recent study published through the University of Montana described this point perfectly. The study essentially concluded that you can no longer draw a line around a landscaped area and just protect it from external threats, leave it alone, and expect biodiversity to thrive in place. And that's simply because the landscapes are expected to change so drastically in the coming years due to climate change that it's really crucial for wildlife to be able to move from one changing protected area to the next protected area that can provide wildlife with the resources that they need to survive. So looking at this map, and just to illustrate it, the perfect example here is the Olympic Peninsula. Obviously, we have Olympic National Park here in the corner, and it's a protected area, and yet still on this map, it's dark red as one of the most at-risk places. And that in part has to do with Interstate 5 bisecting the peninsula here from mainland Washington. Habitat are not able to move back and forth from that peninsula as they need to. So what do we want to see? Shameless plug here for Wildlands Network. Wildlands Network GIS specialists and scientists have been busy putting together maps that show here in this dark space core habitats, and then in the light green space the linkages that we hope we can conserve in between these core habitats to help wildlife move through the landscape. Now that's the landscape portion of wildlife connectivity and hotspots and connectivity. But I want to get back to the other main factor, and that's public safety, which is a big part of this presentation today. So public safety is a huge factor in why we should care about implementing wildlife corridors and roadway crossings. Wildlife vehicle collisions are up 7.2% from last year, with 2.1 million collisions reported. This car here is the victim of striking a moose, and obviously the moose is actually the victim as well. But because of crashes like this, there are 26,000 human injuries reported each year, along with 200 deaths reported from wildlife vehicle collisions. And along with loss of life and injury comes $8 billion a year in property damage and other costs associated with wildlife vehicle collisions. So why should we invest in wildlife infrastructure aside from what I just explained with wildlife and people? I do want to point out some just direct and indirect cost savings that wildlife crossings tend to produce. So first, touching on reducing costs associated with recovering a species. It is very expensive to work on recovering imperiled species. The Defenders of Wildlife recently just published a report that conservatively estimated that $1.5 billion a year was needed to address recovering endangered species in this country. And many of these threatened and endangered species are actually threatened by roadways as well. Just to provide one more stat that I always find alarming, the Department of Transportation estimates that 365 million animals are killed on US roadways every single year, which is more than the total number of people in this country every single year being struck by vehicles. So if we can prevent wildlife vehicle mortalities, then we can have healthier wildlife populations, hopefully less species being listed as endangered and threatened, and in turn, indirectly saving costs associated with recovering those species. So that's one of the benefits, more indirect. More direct is the cost savings associated with the wildlife vehicle collisions directly. So looking at Oregon alone, the annual costs associated with just deer and elk collisions in 2020 was almost $57 million. So if you're able to properly site corridors in these places where you're having hotspot wildlife vehicle collisions, these corridors that you're implementing and building, while expensive, can quickly pay for themselves just by reducing the costs associated with those collisions that you're reducing. So I'm here today to talk a little bit how the movement for wildlife corridors and crossings has really grown over time. And to discuss the rise in popularity of connectivity in corridors, I have to first again give Wildlands organization just a quick plug, because we're celebrating our 30th anniversary this year. For the past 30 years, we've been in the business of studying and protecting core habitats and corridors. And I'd also like to point out that tribes have been involved in this area for a very long time. Some of these tribes have been collecting data on wildlife movement and connectivity since the 1980s. So really longer than I've been alive. So really important to point out just how long that they've been involved in this. But connectivity in corridors really began to get some more support and resources in the early 2000s. In 2007, the Western Governors Association approved a policy to protect wildlife corridors and crucial wildlife habitat in the western states. In 2008, the federal government also designated the first wildlife corridor with the path of the pronghorn in the western states. And more recently, in 2018, Secretary Zinke issued Secretarial Order 3362, which was designed to improve big game winter range migration corridor habitat through partnerships with fish and wildlife agencies in 11 different western states. But what I'm here to discuss more today, I definitely wanted to cue it up with a little bit of a timeline of what's been done to date. But what I'm here to discuss today is the swift increase in local government policies and tribal efforts that have really sort of swept the nation in the last few years. So I put together this map, and in blue, these are the places where we've been able to pass legislation and also enact some executive orders that do a variety of things like tasking the DOTs and wildlife agencies with the task of studying and figuring out where to put wildlife corridors, funding corridors, designating corridors, a bunch of different things that these bills are doing, which we'll get into. And these light blue states are the states that they've introduced legislation, but for whatever reason, we've not been able to pass legislation there yet. So getting into the bills themselves a little bit, I'll start here on the left with the study bills, and just want to point out too that some of these bills really fall into more than one category, but I've separated them out like this. So in 2019 and 2020, there was a flurry of study bills that was passed. And I want to point to New Mexico, Oregon, and Virginia, because all of their bills are very similar. And essentially, those are the bills that task the state DOTs and wildlife agencies with going out and collecting information and figuring out where these wildlife vehicle collisions are happening and what the state can do to improve connectivity for wildlife. So New Mexico actually just released its Wildlife Corridor Action Plan, or the draft of it, recently, and Oregon and Virginia are expected to release their Wildlife Corridor Action Plans later this year. And with that, I want to jump quickly just to the funding bills section, these two green bills here. You have Oregon and you have Virginia, and this is really the second phase of legislation stemming from the 2019 and 2020 bills. So the study bills are really, again, studying, figuring out where we need to put crossings and do land stewardship. But here in the funding bills section, it's figuring out how to get the money to implement that. And both states are pursuing the avenue of getting some surplus funds from their state budget this year to put into grants or state managed grants accounts to be able to fund these projects. I also just want to go back quickly and highlight the executive order piece. For some reasons, it's just the legislation isn't always the best avenue for each state. Sometimes governors are just very supportive of this work and they would like to issue their own executive orders that, again, designate, require studies, and put money towards certain project connectivity projects. And the last bill I'll highlight, just simply for time here, is the Florida Wildlife Corridor Act, which was a very big, exciting bill that was passed last summer. And this bill focuses really on land acquisition for one arterial corridor that goes right through the center of Florida and has been identified as crucial for the Florida panther as well as some other wildlife. But the biggest part of this bill that's super exciting is, again, Florida went the same route as Virginia and Oregon and going after some surplus funding to make these connectivity projects happen. And Florida was able to get $300 million set aside for wildlife corridors. So they have really set themselves up great to implement some of these wildlife corridor connectivity projects. So that's some of the exciting stuff going on at the state level in the last few years. I also just want to get back to tribal nations that have been involved in this work. As I said, some of these tribes have been collecting information since the 1980s. Right now, there are 19 tribes currently involved in this work that we know of, and we've been working with the Native American Fish and Wildlife Society, who's been organizing this initiative of tribes to help get more funding for them and also help get their wildlife corridors on the map. And part of that is really just strength in numbers, getting the groups together to advocate for federal dollars. So aside from the Wildlife Crossing Pilot Program, which Renee will get into, the tribes are backing the Federal Tribal Wildlife Corridor Bill and Recovering America's Wildlife Act as avenues to be able to get more funding for their work. So if there are any tribes watching this, I highly recommend reaching out to Shaylin Miller with Native American Fish and Wildlife Society. They're doing great work in this area and want more tribes to get involved. So a few of the things that I'll note here in the last 2 minutes of my presentation is some states are really moving forward with this work with or without an executive order or legislative mandate. Arizona and New Jersey being some of them. Both states have done some mapping work to figure out where they can implement wildlife crossings and land stewardship activities to make sure that wildlife are able to move through the landscape without issue. And then as far as local efforts go, I've highlighted these two because they're more urban efforts. It is impossible to list all of the local efforts for wildlife corridor mapping and connectivity. It's really becoming popular and important piece of city work. And so I'll just highlight, since we're in Oregon and since one of these wildlife corridors is basically in my backyard, I'll just highlight that the Portland Metro Association, they are part of a regional habitat connectivity working group that maps the region's remaining corridors and works to improve connectivity through stewardship and public education. And they really focus on, as far as existing corridors, it's really riparian in Portland. So they're doing a lot of great riparian work here in Portland. And then I want to highlight the Ventura County local zoning ordinance. And basically that's the only zoning ordinance of its type in California. And what that does is requires the county to basically put together an environmental assessment before approving development that takes into consideration habitat, connectivity, and wildlife corridors, particularly to help improve populations with the endangered mountain lions in that area. And it is a very strong ordinance. In fact, it just survived a lawsuit. A judge struck down a challenge from developers that were basically challenging the ordinance. So it's very strong. It's very exciting that it is that strong. And I hope that we do have some copycat ordinances because of it. And my last slide here, it's important to touch on before we push over to Renee here, but the biggest barrier to improving connectivity has always been funding. Back in 2014, there were 500 plus federal and state DOT personnel that were surveyed, and 68% of them said that funding was their #1 barrier to implementation. I've been involved in this work since 2018, and time again, we're sitting at that legislative table, drafting table, and just thinking, okay, what is going to be the funding mechanism? And it's funding for implementation, like the picture you'll see up here, the road crossing, but it's also funding for data collection, finding out where those animals are through collaring efforts and other efforts. So with that, I'm going to kick it over to Renee, who's going to tell us a little bit more about some new opportunities to hopefully fund some of these projects that the states are putting together in tribes.
Awesome. Thank you, Erin. I'm going to hopefully share my screen and get started. Let's see. Can folks see that?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. So thanks everyone for joining today. Thanks for the great intros. My name is Renee Callahan. I'm the Executive Director of ARC Solutions, joining you from Bozeman today. For those of you who are not familiar with ARC, we are a not-for-profit network. We work on raising awareness about the proven success of crossing infrastructure and reducing crashes involving wildlife, and also fostering innovation in the placement, construction, and design of wildlife crossing structures. I would invite folks to please visit us online at arc-solutions.org if you'd like to learn more about our work, or feel free to reach out to me after today. So today is going to be a little bit of a whirlwind tour of some of the wildlife-related provisions that just came out in the new bipartisan infrastructure law, including new and expanded funding eligibilities, and also a few policies. I do just want to say, my talk isn't intended to be comprehensive. There are a number of existing federal programs for which crossings are currently eligible, and unless they were changed by the new law, I won't be including those programs today. So the focus is really on what's new, what's changed with that law that passed last November. So this is a quick rundown of some of the new and expanded funding that was approved in that new law. and I will get started with these. You'll see I'll have more or less attention to different ones depending upon how much guidance we have in terms of how the programs will be rolled out. So the first program I want to highlight is, which has been getting a lot of attention in the press, which I'm excited about, is this Standalone Wildlife Crossing pilot. So this pilot program creates, for the first time ever, a 5-year, $350 million competitive grant program. It's specifically dedicated for projects that are aimed at reducing wildlife vehicle collisions while improving habitat connectivity. I've listed the eligible applicants here. It's state DOTs, of course, federal land managers, tribes, local governments, as well as other sort of special purpose transportation districts. I've also identified the eligible project partners here, which includes NGOs. I think the key point that I would just want to underscore about this funding is that it is dedicated. So unlike many of the other federal highway programs, crossings won't be competing with potholes or other transportation priorities under this. In addition to those sort of primary touchstones of projects that will reduce wildlife vehicle collisions while improving habitat connectivity, the statute also includes additional secondary selection criteria. I've listed them here, and just to call out a few, it's the ability to leverage non-federal funding, benefits to local economies, whether the project includes outreach and education elements, monitoring and research, or innovative technologies, including innovative design. ARC was especially excited to see the inclusion of design, given in particular our focus on the next gen of wildlife crossing infrastructure design. I think it's also worth noting that 60% of the funding under this program is earmarked for rural projects in rural areas. So in addition to the new wildlife crossing pilot, there are a number of other programs for which eligibility was either expanded or there were new programs. So the first one I want to touch upon is the Surface Transportation Block Grant Program. This is a significant program, $72 billion over 5 years of the law. It's been expanded to include both construction of wildlife crossing structures, as well as projects and strategies that are aimed at reducing the number of wildlife vehicle collisions. The new law also expands the list of projects that are eligible under the Nationally Significant Freight and Highway Program. That list of projects has been expanded to include wildlife crossing structures as a way of improving both freight and highway safety. This next program that I'd like to highlight, this is one of the existing programs known as the Federal Lands Transportation Program. For folks who are familiar with the program will know that wildlife infrastructure is already eligible. But what you may not know is that there used to be a $10 million annual cap on how much federal land managers could spend on mitigation measures aimed at reducing wildlife vehicle collisions. That $10 million cap was doubled to $20 million per year under the new law. The law also includes a new program that's aimed at encouraging investment in bridges. Although the focus is on repairing bridges that are in poor or nearly poor condition, up to 5% of the available funding under this program may be used to replace or rehabilitate culverts, with the goal of improving aquatic habitat connectivity and resiliency of the infrastructure to flooding. I also want to flag this new hybrid formula grant program. It's known as it's a long name, Promoting Resilient Operations for Transformative, Efficient, and Cost-Saving Transportation, otherwise known as the PROTECT program for short. This program provides funding for two new types of improvements that are known as natural infrastructure and also protective features. And although the program is focused primarily on improving infrastructure resiliency, it offers the potential to improve habitat connectivity at the same time. For example, during projects to upsize culverts or to raise or lengthen bridges, with the expectation that as you are raising or lengthening those bridges or upsizing those culverts, that it will improve aquatic connectivity, and that there may also be low-hanging fruit opportunities to improve terrestrial connectivity as well. The next program I want to highlight is this National Culvert Removal, Replacement, and Restoration Grant program. This focuses in particular on restoring safe passage for anadromous fish, and especially on stocks that are either already or could reasonably become threatened or endangered in the near future. The next two items I'll touch upon, they're technically part of the portion of the new law, but they are rather included under the energy title. But I think it's worth flagging them for this audience in particular. The first is this $250 million program. It's aimed at remediation of National Forest System roads and trails. It includes eligible activities related to restoring fish passage. Priority projects include activities related specifically to restoring habitat and safe passage for threatened, endangered, or sensitive fish or wildlife species. And then the second item under that energy title I want to flag is this one-time infusion of $80 million. It's focused on large landscape aquatic restoration projects on federal as well as tribal forest and rangeland. The focus is on fish passage and water quality. It can be up to $5 million per project, and projects that will restore the most miles of stream at the lowest federal cost are the ones that will be prioritized under this project selection process. This isn't specifically related to reducing crashes with wildlife, but I wanted to let folks know there is a new law. The new law also includes this $10 million grant program to benefit pollinators. Federal land managers, tribes, as well as states are all eligible entities for this funding. The focus is on promoting pollinator-friendly practices, in particular on roadsides and along highway rights-of-way. And I'm now going to sort of switch gears and highlight a couple of policy-related elements that were included within the law. And I don't have time to cover all the ones that I've flagged here, but I did want to call out a couple in particular that I think will be of interest for folks. So the first one is that the statutory definition of construction was revised by the new law. It's now been revised to expressly include improvements to reduce the number of wildlife vehicle collisions, and it specifically calls out wildlife crossing structures as being eligible under that definition. The next element calls for the Secretary to update and expand the 2008 report to Congress on wildlife vehicle collisions. This is one of those go-to resources for folks who work on this issue, looking at how to pretty much everything related to reducing wildlife vehicle collisions. It's now over a decade old, and so I'm excited that Congress has called for a new report. Among other things, it will look at, it'll expand upon it'll update, what was included in the 2008 version, and also address some new materials as well. Among other things, it will talk about, the updated sort of causes and impacts of crashes, impacts of highways and traffic on habitat connectivity. And I'm especially excited about a section that's going to talk in particular about the economics and look at some of the costs and benefits of investing in wildlife crossing infrastructure. So the next item I want to flag for folks is a call for the Secretary to develop a standardized methodology for collecting and reporting spatially accurate wildlife collision and carcass data. as well as a national template that will encourage the voluntary implementation and uptake of that new methodology. I know for folks who've been working on this issue a lot longer than I've been, this is one of those things that people have been wanting to see for a long time. So it was exciting to see this included in the legislation. The next two items I'm going to focus on relate to voluntary guidance. In particular, the Secretary is called upon to establish a voluntary guidance on a threshold for determining whether a highway should be evaluated for potential mitigation measures. And the Secretary is also called upon to issue guidance on developing voluntary joint statewide transportation and wildlife action plans. Again, both of these guidances are voluntary, but it will be, I think, exciting to have them out and have the federal highways imprimatur of here's the guidance that they think the state should be looking to when it comes to these important topics. And the last policy item I want to flag calls for the Secretary to develop a series of in-person and online workforce development and technical training courses. They're to be updated every 2 years and made available to transportation as well as fish and wildlife professionals. So if you're interested in learning more about this topic after today's webinar, I want to point folks to this Federal Highways website. It's on the bipartisan infrastructure law. I've included the URL there. But even if you were to search for federal highways and bipartisan infrastructure law, it should be the first thing that comes up. And there's some wonderful resources on this webpage, including a 75-page PowerPoint for folks who really want to dig into the details about some of the new programs. And they are just periodically updating the site with new information as soon as it's released on the various programs, including upcoming notices of funding opportunities. So in closing, I'd just like to also invite folks, ARC has on its homepage a rotating carousel, and one of the first images on that carousel is a link, includes a link to some of the resources that we are posting on our website. They do relate specifically to the wildlife elements of the bill. So not as broad, of course, as Federal Highways website, but we'll be posting things there as well. So thanks everyone for joining today, and I look forward to hearing your questions at the end.
All right, great. Thanks, Renee. I'm gonna take over the screen.
Yes.
Is it working? Okay, well, thanks everyone. My name is Kylie Paul. I'm a road ecologist for the Center for Large Landscape Conservation, and that's an organization working on connectivity and road ecology based in Bozeman, Montana, and working nationally and internationally. So I'm going to talk to you about ways in which an organization or stakeholder might engage to help develop wildlife crossing projects and partnerships. First, I will very briefly cover the effectiveness of some of these wildlife crossing structure tools at reducing wildlife vehicle collisions and facilitating wildlife movement. If you see here in the green, that's essentially fences and underpasses and overpasses combined are the ones that are the most effective in terms of reducing collisions and at improving movement for wildlife. I'm not going to go much further into the science of road ecology, into details of what specifically makes a really good crossing structure or which mitigation tool to use. There's a lot to share there, and that's for a different presentation at a different day. But overall, I did want to cover it here to give some thoughts. Wildlife crossing structures and projects, they can run from really small scale efforts to large scale efforts. They can be these large overpasses or underpasses, or they can be just adding wildlife exclusion fencing between already existing bridges to funnel wildlife to those bridges, or improvements to existing culverts to help wildlife move through them, like benches for little smaller mammals. And while some of these projects can happen swiftly, a lot of these efforts take quite a lot of time and planning, and funding. Now, a lot of what I'm going to be talking about here can be found in this toolkit that the center produced. And we produced it in relation to the federal funding that Renee just went into depth into. But these tips and best practices that I'll be talking about here of how you get involved relate to projects regardless if you're trying to pursue pilot program funding. So I will be covering basically what it takes to get involved. First, you need to know, get a sense for what the catalyst might be for having a wildlife crossing project in your mind. Determining goals, seeking partnerships, determining locations, understanding the policies and processes, determining funding sources, and educating and informing the public. So what's it take? Well, sometimes there's just a really obvious need. Sometimes there's a dinosaur in the road. Ha, ha, ha. Okay. Other times there are landowners and public that are frustrated by roadkill hotspots, or organizations and agencies doing science that focus on a certain habitat or certain species that see this need. Sometimes there's inspiration for new funding sources, or from new funding sources like the funding bill that's gone through. Sometimes there are motivated departments of transportation, or DOT, agency employees. Maybe there's a state DOT report that's come out about this, or there's legislation regarding connectivity or safe passage like Erin touched on. So knowing what your catalyst is then, and it all comes into play together with determining your goals. So whatever your goals are, the big picture of a project will really define the options for the approaches, partners, data sets, locations, funding, and all that. So all this should be determined early on. So if your overall purpose is just to reduce collisions and protect humans, and that's it, just put up a fence. But if you're interested in also allowing for wildlife movement, then you need to include an underpass or a culvert or overpass with that fencing. Then you need to consider, are you looking at what species? Are you looking at just big game and ungulates? Are you looking instead at, or also at specific small creatures, threatened and endangered species, and so on? Are you looking at a state, like an entire state? Are you looking just at a regional location? Are you looking at multiple states? There's a lot that goes into considering that issue. Then are you looking at what kind of land ownership? Are you just interested in where there's public lands only? Or are you also interested and available to examine private lands as well? Are you looking at a small scale short-term tool? Or are you looking for big long-term tools at a big scale? And are you looking at just new infrastructure, or are you looking to use existing structures that are already there, like bridges and so on, and make changes to them for wildlife? So those are lots of things to think about there. Meanwhile, seeking partnerships is essentially the way to do it all. While some projects can really happen with just a state DOT or some other approach, most all these projects really require partnerships. And you can look to see if there are already partnerships that are in existence. You could join a coalition that's already been coming together. In some states, there are coalitions across the state. Colorado, Virginia, Montana, they have some statewide coalitions already at work. You can look, sometimes there's regional or local efforts. There's a Summit County Safe Passages group in Colorado. There's a Southern Oregon Wildlife Crossing Coalition. There is a Staying Connected initiative in the East Coast. So some of these are already happening. If you don't have one near you, you can consider creating one. You can reach out then to those existing partnerships in these other places to see what did they learn, how did they set that kind of thing up. And if you are setting up a coalition, it's really important to get the right folks involved, get the right experts, get the decision makers, get the stakeholders, look to see the multiple entities across different kinds of jurisdictions with different data sets and policies and authority and funding pools. So it's valuable to kick into all sorts of different kind of partnership groups there. There's also other ways to engage in partnerships. You can help spur agency level collaboration. So There have been summits that have occurred in different states like Wyoming, Montana, Colorado, that have been held to catalyze these efforts and to share information between agencies and stakeholders. There have been also, one approach is to help encourage a formal partnership agreement between state agencies, so between wildlife and state transportation agencies, through perhaps a memorandum of agreement or memorandum of understanding that really creates a formal process for them, or more of an official way to share data, to work together. So those are some ways to get involved. Next, the placement of wildlife crossing structures is obviously very important in governing the effectiveness of that tool at reducing wildlife vehicle collisions and improving wildlife habitat connectivity. There's a lot of ways to select locations. Due to time and scope today, I'm going to really generalize and simplify it here. Overall, it's best to do an analysis where you go through a clear selection process that helps select best sites with the best data. And that's great to have it straightforward and a clear selection process, because that helps convey the importance of the project to funders and to the public. So it's looking at a broad area like state or region. You consider all the relevant data and data sets, and you pick locations using these clear identification and prioritization processes. There are some really good recent efforts that have been undertaken in this manner. In, for instance, Highway 3 in Alberta, Canada, in the Crow's Nest Pass. And with New Mexico, they just did that one that Aaron mentioned. Teton County in Wyoming did something here. The Blackfeet tribe in Montana. These are just some of the many examples that exist. Then you'll need at that point to, or at some point there, to select the appropriate mitigation measure or wildlife crossing structure or combination of structures and measurements and so on. And I, again, very briefly discussed those earlier and won't delve into them here too much here. Okay, so for a project to really be effective, it's best to have selected the location with the highest collision risk and the highest conservation priority. So you'll need various data sets, locations of crash and collisions. So these locations of wildlife vehicle collisions to show where there's current problems for crossing. Then you need wildlife habitat, areas of habitat connectivity to show where wildlife want to move or currently move. These are not always at the same places as the roadkill hotspots. Sometimes roadkill hotspots are where they're trying to and just unsuccessfully happening. Or sometimes the connectivity kind of wildlife spots are they're currently successful at this stage of the game running across the road in those spots. But with the traffic reconfiguration or increasing volume over time with increased population, those will be really bad spots for roadkill. So you need both roadkill and movement to really address the issue. And then there's other additional criteria and data to look at: traffic volume, current and future. Land protection, it's really important to have protected land in perpetuity on both sides of the roadway. So that might be public land, it might be areas where you have or want to seek out conservation easements on private land. Then you need to consider also engineering feasibility. That might be a great spot, a really important spot for wildlife, but if it can't happen because of engineering, water tables, soil types and the like, some other approach needs to be examined there. And then cost benefit is a consideration to examine that can really help clarify areas where wildlife crossing structures can offset the high cost to society of roadkill hotspots if you put them in the right spots, in the right locations. So cost benefit analyses can be really valuable. And there's other stuff to look at: political viability, key partner support, all sorts of things, lots to go into there. But so that's locations. And then it's really important for you to understand the planning and processes that can direct or impact these kind of projects. So it's important to take the time to understand the process of how a project of any kind moves through a state DOT, from planning to getting on the ground. It can be really complicated, and it helps you understand where you might fit in. And you can learn how those projects might come to pass by conversing with your district engineer or an environmental specialist with your DOT, or look at a horrible project flowchart online that's really complicated and confusing, but it still helps you understand how complicated this stuff can be. You can look to see if, for one thing, how and when wildlife might be considered in any kind of design consideration of a transportation project. There are some kinds of projects that are much more conducive to engaging or involving wildlife considerations, like a bridge reconstruction or a full lane area highway stretch reconstruction, much more so, say, than a resurfacing of pavement. So it's important to look at what kind of project might be there. And you can learn that by looking at your long-term planning, and particularly your state's Transportation Improvement Program, or STIP. Every state has one, 4 to 5 year plan, to see upcoming projects and consider whether you might be able to influence them to some level. Then you also need to see, regardless of projects that are already happening just for transportation reasons, whether and how and if there are ways that standalone wildlife projects might be able to happen. So that's an important step to see if your state even has a process set up for that. And long and the short of it is to engage really early. These things take forever in terms of transportation projects. There's a lot to learn. Not all wildlife crossings all projects take forever. It's just that getting involved in planning is important early on, because the planning part can take a while. And that can be smoothed along with, if you have a good relationship or partnership with DOT partners, with your DOT champion, again, to see who's the best to work with most smoothly. You can find out ways that you might be able to help with the capacity and resource limitations within a Department of Transportation. You can see if there's state legislative policies to develop, like the one Erin discussed, or funding opportunities to help create the match funding for federal funding. Or you can see if you can help initiate a liaison position between wildlife and transportation agencies to smooth the way there. And you can look at, other than your state DOT, you can look to see if there's other agencies you can look at transportation plans of, for the National Park Service or Fish and Wildlife Service lands and stuff. Okay, so that's policy. Then you can work on helping with funding. So funding is, of course, a huge part of these projects and can be a really important part for role for partnerships. Renee covered federal funding options at this stage, so I'm not going to talk about those. But if you're seeking federal funding, almost always they require or encourage match from non-federal sources. And so that's what I'll touch on here. So those can include partner funding options. Partners, we might have access to granting opportunities like environmental foundations that DOTs or other agency folks might not have access to. There might be public funds through state and county programs like open space conservation programs that could help with land acquisition or easements. And then, of course, there's private funding that can help with donations and the like. So in regard to donations, some agencies don't really have a fund or a way in order to have people be able to pool their donated funds or their ideas or their funding dollars to help with ideas for these kinds of projects. So you can help set up a fund, perhaps with an agency or within a legislature or with an associated foundation. And then making sure there's actually a process for the DOT to be able to use those funds, or for a partner group to use those funds with the DOT for a project. That kind of process is actually needed as well. And there's other creative ways to help with funding. There's specialty license plates, there's sales taxes. There's a variety of ways that states and regions have worked out to try to raise some extra funding here. Then finally, at any point, it's important to educate and inform the public of these kind of projects. The projects will be much more successful, and federal funding programs like the Wildlife Pilot Program will be more likely to receive funding in the future if the public understands and appreciates the benefits of wildlife crossing structures at reducing collisions and improving human safety and benefiting wildlife populations. So it's really important to make sure when you're undertaking involvement with these projects to ensure there's some kind of thought towards communications and public outreach. There's, of course, as we all know, lots of tools to use for education: movies, social media, wildlife camera footage, story maps, field trips, adorable poster contests like this one. And those kind of adorable poster contests can come about if you connect with educators to get students on board and learning about these kind of projects. And then beyond just the public, it's important also to have the experts talk to the experts. So getting transportation and natural resource professionals to share their expertise and experiences with each other for these peer learning opportunities, getting departments of transportation, getting their engineers together, getting engineering consulting firms who actually do the design and construction on these structures, getting them to kind of hear from each other. Those are really important ways you can involve yourself too. So all in all, there's a wealth of approaches you can take as a person or group or an agency to engage in helping develop wildlife crossing projects and partnerships. And we hope you'll do that. And please keep in touch with any questions or concerns as you do. My contact info is here, and I appreciate the time here. Thanks.
Okay, I want to say thank you to all of our panelists for such a great presentation. We'll now start the Q&A portion of the panel, so please drop any questions for the panelists into the Q&A function. We already have some waiting, so I'll start off. Question for Renee. Is ARC a good resource for a list of all those grant opportunities you described? If not, where should folks go to find those?
Awesome, thanks. Great question. So we do have a variety of resources on our site already. They are much more higher level sort of summary, basically flagging that there's been either an expanded eligibility or new eligibility. So I would invite folks, again, if you look at our homepage, our carousel on the front, the very first image on that carousel references the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which is the other name for what people call the bipartisan infrastructure law. And it will take you to some of those summaries. We are also working with some of our partners on a summary, a compilation effectively of the programs with that expanded eligibility with some more details. Because federal highways is under a continuing resolution and they aren't yet able to stand up any new programs at this time until we get a proper fiscal year budget for this year. We are relying basically on what is in the statute itself, and that's going to be greatly enhanced once federal highways comes out with specific guidance on these programs. But we will look to take the summaries that are based on the statute and enhance them with links and additional flags as federal highways begins to release some of those guidance documents, which we hope will happen soon after a fiscal year budget is approved in the Congress. So thank you.
Thank you, Renee. Our next question is for all the panelists. It's, are hunting communities proponents of these wildlife crossings? And from your experience, what are the major industries or groups that oppose the idea of wildlife crossings?
I can probably jump in with that one. And then Kylie, if you want to fill in any of the blanks that I leave behind, please do. But I would say that hunting communities in particular are very supportive of wildlife crossings. I mean, their interest is keeping the herds that they're hunting, genetically robust. They want to keep these populations strong. And also, I mean, there's a huge cost associated with losing, deer, moose, elk when they get struck by vehicles on the roadway. So they're very interested in keeping the animals alive and keeping them moving. As far as crossings go, I don't know about industries essentially that are against crossings. I do know that there are some people concerned about private property rights and having people come onto their property to use the crossing, but that hasn't been an issue yet. And so those fears have sort of been quelled. When it comes to landscape connectivity, there are a few more opponents there, but since this is specific to road crossings, unless Kylie, if you know of any other groups that are against road crossings, or Renee.
Just to generalize it, there have been not very many, and I think it tends to be folks who are pretty fiscally conservative or really fiscally conservative and with taxpayer thoughts and kind of the hands-off kind of folks. So overall, though, the issue is gigantically supported because it's human safety. It's pretty clearly, it's got the human safety piece. So everybody human wants to help be safe on the roadways. And then there's the wildlife component too, that other folks are also, in addition, really supportive of. So it's pretty positive overall approach.
I would just echo what Erin and Kylie have said. I think it's my understanding that the very first wildlife crossing structure, which was built in France, was actually as a result of hunter efforts. I think that was built in the 1950s. And the other thing I would say is that there's an incredible wealth of hunting organizations. And I won't even try to name them because there are so many who have been involved in this effort and who are putting skin in the game in terms of, involved with the camera trap monitoring of the structures to help establish effectiveness and then otherwise coming up with funding and being incredibly supportive. And then just two, I think on the fiscally, I think this is actually one of those issues that is also supported by a lot of people, even if you're fiscally conservative. I mean, when you look at some of the cost-effective percentages in terms of the way that the infrastructure reduces crashes, I'm not aware of almost, I couldn't tell you another piece of transportation infrastructure that's going to take the problem that you're addressing and reduce it 97%. So if you had a roadway last year that had 100 crashes on it, and this year, after you've put in a properly sited wildlife crossings with fencing, et cetera, to guide the animals to them, you end up with 3 crashes this year. So to me, that's it's my understanding that that effectiveness is really kind of off the charts. So wherever you have, there's documentation out there that if you have a stretch of roadway that averages about 5 deer vehicle collisions per mile per year, it actually costs society more to do nothing than it would cost to put in some crossing infrastructure as is appropriate for your project, put in your associated fencing and effectively eliminate those crashes. Because otherwise, we as a society, every time someone gets into a car accident, there's an injury or even worse, of course, a death, we as a society are spending that money today. Whether we like it or not, we might as well spend it on infrastructure that will fix the problem.
Thank you so much. I see that we're getting to be about time, so I want to ask and check and see if there's any more questions.
I see one Julius raised here of if there's any if we've worked with Yellowstone Yukon Conservation Initiative. I can say resoundingly yes. We all 3 of us. There's a great coalition and just basically network of organizations working on this issue, and we all work pretty closely hand in hand because it's just a uniting topic, and there's so much work to be done that we do work really closely together with Y2Y and with each other here and others. So yes.
Thank you. All right, so I want to thank everyone in the audience for coming, as well as our panelists.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yep, thank you.